Right, we'll start recording now. The online screencast began to talk about the classical period of Greek art, which begins with the Persian War around 480 BC, where the city of Athens, the city-state of Athens, defeated their Persian enemies in a massive battle that was fought in Athens. And this ushers in this amazing period of Greek history, not only in art, but in literature, in philosophy, in history writing even. Herodotus comes from this same time period. It's really the zenith of Greek history, is this period of the middle of the 5th century and beyond. And as we talked about what makes classical Greek art different, I talked about online, what makes classical Greek art different from the previous archaic period, one of the things we talked about was contrapposto, which the Greeks didn't use that word, the Latins did, the Romans did, when they started copying these things. The Greek word was chiastic balance. But what it basically means, both of the terms mean, is this idea of a figure at rest, or perhaps prepared for action, and that rest, that preparation for action, being visually communicated through counterpoised parts of the body understood in relation to other parts of the body. And what Polykleitos, the sculptor, did was he wrote a treatise for other artists on perfect ratios for the perfect human body. In other words, the arm should be this many wrists long. The torso should be understood in this relationship, this ratio to the legs. Right? Every part of the body is understood in a ratio to other parts of the body. Right? But in addition to that, he also talked about this contrapposto pose, where one part of the body is flexed. For example, his proper right leg on your left is bearing all of the weight of the sculpture. It's flexed. The opposite leg is relaxed, counterpoised. We move up the torso. His left arm on your right is flexed, right? It's bent. His right arm hangs relaxed. So, counterpoised again, but not always on the same side, right? The flexed side alternates side to side. And you'll also notice that one foot is back, right? Shoulder forward. Yeah? And you'll also notice that while the torso faces ever so slightly to your right, you see how his body twists slightly to open up to the right? His face turns the other direction. Right? And where the ankles exist on an angle sort of like that, the knees counteract that, as do the hips, but then the shoulder goes the other direction. Right? It's all about juxtaposing different parts of the body to create a sense of, I guess, what you would call homeostasis in a way, right? How everything in the body is working together to create homogeneity, consistency. And this gives it that sense of being at rest, not really doing anything in particular, but at the same time prepared to do anything. This figure is capable of whatever he should choose to do, but we catch him at a moment when he's not really doing much of anything. And this is very different from the earlier Greek sculptures, from the archaic period on your left, where we see a much stronger influence still of ancient Egyptian sculpture. And you'll also notice that he's frozen in the act of walking, and in a rather flat-footed and uneasy manner. Whereas the pose of the spear bearer on your right has much more bearing and grace and realism, even though it's been so perfected. This is what really comes into the classical period. This is what the classical period really is all about, insofar as sculpture is concerned. Come on, come to Papa. There. We see it in all sorts of sculpture. So we looked at the Parthenon online, and we saw this frieze showing the people of Athens bringing gifts to their gods. And we notice that there again we have this contraprosto pose. Right? Now, it's not used quite in exactly the same way, but we do have a flexed leg and a flexed arm, a relaxed arm and a relaxed leg. Right? That easy balance that suggests almost perpetual relaxation, but at the same time a potential of energy to do just about anything we want. And even on pottery, we find very much the same thing, a very similar pose here on a red figure vase from the Walters that comes at the very, very beginning of the classical period. And you see that he's got the weight borne on one leg, flexed, the other opposite arm flexed, one arm relaxed, the opposite leg relaxed, the body turning to your left, the head to the right. It's not as subtle, not as brilliant, if you will, as Polyclitus, but it's got all the principles there. Right? This is the classical period of art. And we even see it in works of art that aren't simply standing. This statue of Dionysus from the Parthenon shows again a figure who isn't doing any particular thing at this moment. But with that tightly coiled abdominal muscles, looks like he's in the middle of doing crunches. Even though really he's just laying there drinking wine. He's Dionysus, the god of wine, right? And the broken hand that's up would have originally held a cup of wine. So he's doing something slight, but it's not a particular frozen moment in a suite of actions. He's just sort of kicking back, right? Miller time, Greek style, yeah? And at the same time, he has the potential, right? He doesn't, his chest muscles and his abdominal muscles aren't relaxed, right? He is prepared, right, to do just about anything. Now, at the end of the classical period, we start to see the contrapposto pose begin to become a little bit more exaggerated. We talked online about the fact that the spear bearer on your right is a Roman copy of a Greek original bronze. And the Romans were very, very exact in making copies of Greek works because they loved them so very much, as we'll talk about next week. The figure on your left, another one by Polyclitus of a type of figures, and again a Roman copy, but you'll notice that while you can make out elements of the contrapposto pose still here, it's significantly more exaggerated in how he kicks his hip out to the side. So it becomes this really sort of extreme S sway from the shoulder out to that hip and back. Right? So later in his career, Polyclitus, our paragon of classical sculpture, begins to move in a new direction. And what we'll see as we move into the 4th century, the 300s, is that this is, in many ways, the dominant trend of the next century of Greek art. What we're seeing with the Narcissus type. So historians have begun to label the 4th century with a new title because some of the classical hallmarks begin to change. So we look at this figure on the left. This is now from about 100 years later, Lysippus' Scoper. He's an athlete just finishing his competition. He's covered his body in olive oil. And he is scraping off the olive oil to clean himself. This is a standard mode of cleansing throughout the years, really, and even to today. If you remember this from Fight Club, that soap is primarily fat, right? With some other things that help to emulsify the dirt. But fat does a darn fine job of emulsifying dirt. If you put it on your hands and you rub it off, most of the dirt comes off in the oil. And that's what he's doing. He's put the oil on his body to get the sweat off, and now he's scraping it. He doesn't find, extra virgin olive oil made it smell kind of nice too, right? Or at least like a salad, right? And so he's scraping off the oil. And I forgot to bring it up, we saw some of the scrapers when we were in Rome. They actually, some of the metal scrapers that they use survive. They look sort of like like a woman's curling iron, right? There's a place to put your hand through it, and then this sort of broad knife, not sharp, that you would use to scrape off your body. So he's cleaning himself, right? And if you look at the figure compared to Polyclitus' figure from 100 years earlier, Lysippos' figure here on the left, again a Roman copy of a Greek bronze, still has contrapposto pose, but has that much more exaggerated version of it that we saw with the late work by Polyclitus. This new, sort of much more elegant sway, this S-shape to the figure. Right? It's derived from Polyclitus, it's derived from the classical contrapposto, but it exaggerates it. And with this we can see a series of other variations on that as well. For example, the body is significantly leaner. You'll notice that the head, relative to the height of the body, is smaller. The proportions are different. He's not quite as broad across the beam, around his midsection. Whereas Polyclitus' figure is really quite wide, not fat, just wide, around his hips, or above his hips. Here he's getting somewhat thinner. The legs appear longer in proportion to the torso. The head smaller in proportion to the torso. You'll also notice, perhaps, that his face is somewhat more expressive. Look in particular at the hair. Notice the degree to which Polyclitus' spear-bearer has hair that looks very much like a skull cap, and that his face has a very aloof, expressionless quality on the right. Lysippos' figure still has some of that, but you're starting to get a sense of it being more portrait-like, more active, and especially with the hair that seems to crawl across his forehead in an almost unkempt manner. This is moving in a different direction, a much more active direction. You'll notice that he's in the middle of an action here, rather than being undefined as to exactly what he's doing. We catch him in a particular moment. It's a frozen moment, right? Caught in the act. Rather than preparing for an action that we don't really know what it is. You'll also notice that he's much more centrifugal, right? Notice how far the arm comes away from the body, right? Compared to the Polyclitus, I remember my undergrad prof, Leonard Kimbrell, God rest his soul, said you could take a classical sculpture and roll it down a hill and you wouldn't really lose much. You'd buy your hand or something. But here, a huge amount of the sculpture is that arm that juts out toward you. Right? He's throwing himself out. It becomes much more dramatic in the way that it gestures. He's not just standing there anymore. Right? This is a new direction of sculpture. And historians have labeled this new direction Hellenistic. And sometimes you see Lysippos called late classical, because he's kind of a transition point. But for simplicity's sake, I just labeled it Hellenistic for you. Right? Why have a fourth Greek period? Three's plenty. Right? Hellenistic. And Hellenistic is the last phase of Greek art, this phase that turns away from the restful repose, the lack of identifiable single action, the timelessness of classical Greek art, towards something that's more dramatic, increasingly more dramatic, something that is more sensual. It appeals to your sense of touch. Maybe it appeals to your emotions a bit, rather than the logic of proportions, in a way. This Hellenistic period is by far the most engaging, I think, of all of the Greek periods. And we'll see it lasts right up to the time of Christ, right? The next 300 years. And there we can see his face, where we get a sense now of the fact that that face seems to have some personality to it. He's got puffy cheeks, for example. And he actually seems to have some expression. His eyebrows pull up in the middle. He's looking upward. And his hair is tousled rather than matted to his skull so closely. Online, I talked about the fact that I think part of what Polyclitus was trying to do with the spear bearer is make a face that didn't detract you from the body, so that you would focus entirely on the perfect proportions of the musculature. And we're moving away from that. And we'll see with later Hellenistic sculpture that indeed the sense of inner activity, the sense of inner personality and individuality, this increases as we move our way through Hellenistic art. Right? So this is a historian's term, Hellenistic, right? It's not like the Greeks woke up in 330 or like Lysippus looked at it and say, hey, I'm Hellenistic, right? It's what we categorized it looking back at the past as a way to figure out and maybe make it a little bit easier to put things where they belong, to understand the development. That we see a movement away from that repose, that timelessness of classicism here, beginning in the 4th century. Hellenistic. Another Hellenistic piece from your textbook is this work by Praxiteles, Hermes and the infant Dionysus from around the same time. Again, an exaggerated contrapuntal, right? That kicked way out to the side. This development began with Polyclitus, but becomes much more exaggerated as we move into the following century. It's still contrapuntal, but it's not attempting to give us that perfect balance that we saw with Polyclitus. And so this very sinewy S shape to the body. And again, we have a very particular action. Hermes was the teacher of Dionysus. Dionysus, the god of wine. Hermes was his teacher. And here we see him walking Dionysus to school, off to the classroom. And along the way, on the path, he stops and picks some grapes. And he's going to use them to tease Dionysus, who's the god of wine, right? And so as soon as he sees the grapes, he goes, gimme, 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 right? And that's what's going on here is Dionysus' arms are broken off, but little Dionysus on his arm is reaching up to grab at those grapes that Hermes is teasing him with, right? Can't get it, like playing with a cat in a string, we know you want it. And you'll notice that much of the interaction between the two figures is told through gestures that blow away from the core of the statue, right? Hermes' arm way up, little Dionysus' broken arms, right, reaching out. All of this is very Hellenistic and not the sort of thing you would tend to see in the classical period, although there are exceptions, like the discus thrower, right? But for the most part, this is something that's part of the Hellenistic period, right? Here again we have that sensuality. I think that pose gives it a sort of sexiness in a way. And we're going to see other works of art that are significantly more sort of erotic than this one is. In fact, the Greeks said about Praxiteles that no one was better at making sculpture look like flesh than was Praxiteles. And I think when we look at this, we can see that the Bible looks soft. Even though, by the way, this is a Roman copy of a bronze original, right? But the copyist is so exact that he actually got that sense of palpability, touchability, where the marble stops looking like marble and starts to look like if you touched it, it would be, like a marshmallow, that it would actually have some give to it. Even though it's cold, hard stone, it looks like warm flesh. It gets that effect, right? And that sensuality here is obviously feeds the story. Because the story is all about temptation. Hermes is tempting, teasing Dionysus. And in many ways we can see the sculpture teasing us in a way, tempting us, appealing to our senses in the same way that Hermes is in the sculpture, right? This appeals to our sense of touch. Whereas, of course, Hermes is appealing to taste and smell in the story that we see. Mark. You're sure. You've got more on it than I do. So I don't know that part of the story. So that was you're thinking the different one tried to steal fire. That was Prometheus stole fire. But what is Prometheus? That's Latin. What's Prometheus for the Greeks? I don't know. I'll have to look it up. You stumped the chump. Right? At the Walters Art Museum, we have another work by Praxiteles, again a Roman copy after Praxiteles. I meant to animate this, so the thing in the middle came up later. It's a satyr who is pouring wine. You'll notice that the pose is in fact very similar to Hermes on the right. Satyrs were friends of Dionysus. For Greeks, satyrs are half man, half goat, usually. This one, there's not much goat to see here. And in fact, the only sign that he was part goat is around the back, there's a broken tail right above his butt. Right? And for the Greeks, anybody that was half human, half animal, became the exact opposite of what we saw in Assyrian art. You know, when you became half animal in Assyrian art, you became godlike. Right? You became superhuman. Think of Narmer wearing that helmet. Right? Think of all the way back to prehistoric art, the Birdman, right, in the cave. For the Greeks, who think the human body is a sign of perfection, to be half animal means you're subhuman. You're not as civilized as the Greeks might be. So in this case, this satyr figure, pouring wine, shows that in fact he's given over to strong drink, that he knows no restraint. And that he's willing to allow his animal side to take over. Right? Now, I'm not advocating booze, but you know when you have too much, you don't make good decisions, right? The logic sort of disappears. You know, you start to think, that's a good idea, I'll go pee in the corner. And it does, you get caught. And, for the Greeks, that abandoning of logic is the worst possible thing. It's a really bad thing. And so, these friends of Dionysus, even though he's a god of wine, he's temperate. And his friends, however, can't control themselves. So here's a satyr pouring wine, and you can see the pose seems very similar to this other pose by Praxiteles, like he's reusing it. And he's pouring wine out of the jug, sort of showing off, right? Pouring it into a glass 3 feet down. Yeah? And giving himself over to his animal side. But again, that sensuality that Praxiteles can bring with the exaggerated contrapposto pose, in many respects, is often used to emphasize this meaning of the image. Right? These are images about sensual enjoyment. Right? Tasting wine. If you're temperate, you can still enjoy it. And I don't think the Greeks are anywhere to be moralizing anybody. You know what I mean? Like these are attractive things. Yeah? Now, because he was so good with flesh, it should come as no surprise that Praxiteles is responsible for the very first female nude sculpture in all of Greek art. The first one, it's this one. Again, a Roman copy of a bronze original, Aphrodite, the goddess of love. Right? So all of this sensuality, all of this interest in flesh, guess what? He's the first one to give us unclothed women in Greek art, right? At least in Greek sculpture. She is named for the island of Cnidos, where there was a temple to Aphrodite, where this was originally located. The statue itself, right? The original one that this is a copy of, right? There was a bronze original. And by the way, with the bronze originals, you wouldn't need all those support things. Right? You see that big bar that comes from each of their hips? Unnecessary if it's bronze, because they can stand on their own 2 feet. Because metal has a lot more tensile strength. But stone doesn't. So when the Roman copies, that's the one thing they would change, would be to put these supports to hold the arms from breaking off. Whereas in the bronze originals, they didn't need it. Right? So, she's named for the island where she was found, the Cnidian Aphrodite, the Aphrodite from the island of Cnidos. As a Roman copy, there are other versions of it as well. And again, the Walters has one of the Cnidian Aphrodites. There were quite a few of them. It was a very popular sculpture. Again, like other works we've seen from this post-classical period, this Hellenistic period, she has a very exaggerated contrapposto pose. The hip kicked way out. Now, it's still a juxtaposition of flexed and relaxed. We see this in her hands and in her legs, in the way the body turns one direction, the face the other. All of this comes out of the contrapposto, but it's significantly more exaggerated as well. And you'll notice that in exaggerating, what the point is to make it a little bit more erotic. And I think it's kind of fascinating that they can't figure out the faces yet for the women. That kind of makes sense for the Greeks as well, right? She still has what looks like a very classical Greek face, expressionless and whatnot. But what's she up to here? What's she doing? She's caught in the middle of doing something again. She's caught in the act. What's she caught in the act of doing? Sorry? Baby, who said that? Why did you say that, Megan? Yeah, there's a big urn there and a cloth, right? So she's caught in the act of dating. Now, the question is she about to start dating or is she just finished? And I don't think that really matters one way or the other. She's in the middle of either taking her clothes off or putting her clothes back on. And on one level, she's taking them off, then she doesn't know you're there, right? And if she's putting them on, she does, right? She's like covering herself up. And you'll notice that Praxiteles has, altered the contrapposto. She makes that hand just rest right in the right spot, so that it covers up part of her nudity. Yeah. But the idea that she's caught in the act of either robing or disrobing only adds to the eroticism of the piece, because she's supposed to be wearing clothes and she isn't. And you're not really supposed to see her naked. We know for numerous stories of goddesses who are caught naked by humans and they just try to kill them. And that makes it that much more naughty. But that was with Diana. Yeah, exactly. Artemis and Diana catches the goddess Diana at the bath and she turns him into his own dog. Or a stag, that is, and his own dogs kill him, right? So they're very guarded about their nudity. For the guys, it's kind of okay. That's the perfect state. They don't seem, like they should be wearing clothes. But there's something about the figure, the fact that she's got that drapery, she's got that armband on, and that her hand is directly in front of her vagina, suggests that she's still covering up a bit, right? That there's still something that maybe we should not see, that she's not in an idealized state here. We caught her in the act. Yeah. I was going to ask about that. Yeah, I don't know more about the armband. I don't know if it was in our copy at the Walters either. I have to look because we've got two at the Walters. This is the bigger one of the two, right? This is almost full size. A little bit smaller than full size. Yeah.
Was this just a doodle?
Yeah, but in a good way. She's the goddess of love, so it's, it makes sense. So here we could talk about the eroticism of the style, right? And fitting perfectly with the subject matter. It actually enhances the meaning, doesn't it? Right? Because he's emphasizing the fleshiness of it. And I think that fleshiness, he almost comes a little bit more clear with our little copy of the Walters, doesn't it? That there's again that sense of marble looking like soft flesh, right? Like she's carved out of something with some give rather than cold stone, right? So there's an erotic element that we're seeing here, and this is true and becomes even more true as we move out of the 4th century and into later periods of Hellenistic art. The famous Venus de Milo, the Aphrodite from the island of Milos, I think that this is actually a Greek original marble, not a Roman copy. Right, the Venus de Milo from a couple centuries later. And you can see, just like the Cnidian Aphrodite, the pose is actually quite similar, isn't it? Notice from the hips up that it derives from that pose. But the difference is that the hand, her proper right hand, here originally came down and tried to hold the clothing from slipping off her body. And that what our sculptors have done is try to arrange this enhanced contrapposto pose to show her kicking her hip out to try to keep it from falling off. Right? You ever okay, I just flew around, right? They made me take my belt off. So I'm walking through the airport like this, trying to keep my pants from falling down. I got one hand on them and I got my legs apart and I'm out like this so it doesn't fall off. And that's what she's doing here, right? Is trying to keep that clothing from falling off. And our sculptors, I was doing this from Antioch and Meander, right? Has shown us that this is in fact a very erotic thing. It's tauten the act again. And a second later, she's going to lose the battle with wardrobe malfunctions, right? And that robe is going to fall the rest of the way off. She doesn't seem particularly concerned with it because she's the goddess of love. Her whole job, Aphrodite, is to make you feel eroticism, right? To make you feel love, to make you feel attraction. And so having these sculptors that emphasize the erotic content through the style, through the choice of the clothes, this is perfect for the subject matter. Right? So again, it's that heightened contrapposto, that much more exaggerated pose that's typical of the Hellenistic period, but also this idea of being caught in the middle of an act. Right? Not ever at rest. Not prepared for any action, but stuck in the middle of doing something. As you move around the Aphrodite of Milos, the Venus de Milo, you'll see that at certain viewpoints, that pose becomes even more exaggerated. And this is something that we see a lot in Hellenistic sculpture, is this invitation to walk around it, to see it from different points of view, and that as you do, the pose seems to shift and morph as you move your way around. So again, that heightened eroticism that we've seen, that pronounced contrapposto adding to a sort of sensual impact. Now, what about him? Right? It's easy to think of these things as just being statues in museums, but what would happen if you walked down the street and there was somebody laying like that? Even if he's fully clothed, right? This is a really over-the-top erotic image. And I think your question, right, about was there any sort of scandal to these? Well, they're huge. That was one thing to keep in mind, right? Yeah, they're incredibly licentious, aren't they? I mean, they're just really, really lewd. Here's another satyr, right? These friends of Dionysus, who give themselves over to incredibly strong drink and drink way, way too much of it. Again, this eroticism is totally suited to that subject matter. There's another view of him from the front. He's in Munich if you want to go see him face to face, so to speak. A half-human colleague of Dionysus, and we can see he's laying on the goat skin as a symbol of his satyr identity, and he has drank himself to sleep, right? And again, I'm not recommending that you ever had one of those. It's like the worst sleep, isn't it? You wake up more tired than you go to bed because you don't really get a good sleep in, and you're tossing and turning, and you're sweating, and you wake up and your mouth is full of cotton, and or as the French say, a gueule de bois, mouth of wood, right? You get that sense with him as well. That he's got his hand behind his head, that this is not a sleep that is a sleep of peace, of restfulness. This is in fact a figure who is, again, caught in the act, right? And the sculptor has handled it in a way that makes it incredibly sensual, incredibly erotic, right? And, I mean, the Greeks came up with the term pornography, with images of prostitutes. That's what it means in Greece, right? So this wouldn't fit their term pornography. But I don't think it's not safe for work, as they say, right? It's an email that's NSFW. in its way. I don't think that if you owned this, and by the way, the title, the Barberini Fawn, it was it was owned by the cousin of the Pope in the 17th century. So it seemed like even churchmen at that point were kind of okay with this sort of thing. And I think part of it is the safety of distance. You know, he's a Greek sculpture. It's marble. It's okay. It's not the naked guy on the subway, right? Which would make you move to a different car. The period of Hellenistic art coincides with the reign of Alexander the Great. The beginning of it does. One of the great leaders of ancient Greece, conquered most of the Mediterranean for Greece. The reason I bring him in here is to mention the fact that Alexander's teacher, when he was growing up, Alexander the Great, was the philosopher Aristotle. And many historians look back at Hellenistic art and talk about the fact that the developments that we're seeing, sensuality, momentary, caught in the act sorts of sculptures, these have everything to do with the hallmarks of Aristotle's own philosophy, which was the dominant philosophy of the period. What Aristotle basically said, and this is in the philosophy class, but this is in a nutshell, right? The way to understand truth, right? The way to understand deeper meanings is to simply study the world around you. Study different examples in the world around you, and then you can arrive at a knowledge of deeper transcendent truth. Right? It comes through looking around you. It comes from using your senses. And this is the antithesis of the philosopher who was most popular during the classical period, who was Plato. And what Plato said in the 5th century was that the way to understand transcendent truth was to look inside your mind instead. To think of, instead of looking at all the trees out there, think of the perfect tree. Right? And so if we think about the difference between classical sculpture from the time of Plato on your left and Hellenistic sculpture from the time of Aristotle on your right, this locating fact, truth, understanding in the world versus in your mind can be seen as really deeply correlating with the difference in style that we see. So both of these are drinking naked guys, right? And despite the angle that we see him at, which is the angle you're meant to look at him from, this is the angle you're meant to look at Dionysus from, but Dionysus figure doesn't have that erotic charge in the same way. He's naked and it's kind of okay. You know, maybe it's because you can't see the stuff, right? Maybe it's because you can't see his pubic region. But regardless of that, there's something about the pose that doesn't, and the way the sculpture is framed, that doesn't have that same sensual undercurrent as the Barberini Fawn does. So this, in a nutshell, is the difference between the classical period and the Hellenistic period. It's this move towards sensuality that we can actually correlate with changes in Greek philosophy. From Plato being the dominant philosopher of the classical period to Aristotle being the dominant philosopher of the Hellenistic period. Now this statue is less erotic, but again you'll notice that the flesh is handled in a way that suggests that they're not idealizing the body so much as they're looking at how the body really works. So instead of perfecting everything, we start to see the stomach wrinkle up as he lays down, rather than being totally flexed and ready to stand up again. The sculptor, probably Epidamus, and this is another copy, a Roman copy of the bronze original. But the sculptor has attempted to show us this, I don't want to say imperfect body, because it certainly is better than anything I ever had, right? But it's not idealized in the same way. The skin still looks like skin. We can make out the veins underneath the legs. And we can make out again the sense of being caught in the act. he's dying and he's using his last ounce of strength to try to stand up. He's been pierced on the side. You can see the blood running down, right? Sculpted in marble. As he pushes himself up, trying to stand up. On the base, you can see his sword. We'll come around the back here and see the shield. He was on loan to the National Gallery last year, so these were taken downtown. He was living here for about 3 months. There's his face, ancient ancestor of Burt Reynolds. But look at the wild, like right around Smoking the Bandit, with that mustache. But what the face is really got personality, right? It's not expressionless mask that we saw in the classical period, and the hair flying away. Right? The Greeks would never wear a mustache, right? The only Greeks who wore facial hair were philosophers. Yeah? And I heard somewhere, and don't quote me on this, I heard that's why we call barbers because they cut hair, right? Barbarians, but I don't quote me on that, because I haven't looked it up to be sure, right? But again, it's dramatic, right? It's caught in the act. It's sensual, not necessarily erratic, but appealing to your senses very strongly, right? These are all strong hallmarks of the Hellenistic period. One of the hallmarks of this period, insofar as the facial features are concerned, is this concept of pathos. You may have heard the term pathos. It's the root of pathetic, right? Like someone who uses their cell phone in class. Put it away, Carlos. Thanks. Pathos, the basis of sympathy, empathy, pathetic. Right? Pathos, for the Greeks, was a sense of dignified suffering, conveyed through facial features. And we're seeing it here. We'll see it in other works as well. Suffering through the pain, but in a dignified manner. No screaming, wrenching at your fists and whatnot. As you move around the structure, again, the idea that you want to move around it is, I think, a Hellenistic style trait as well. We can see his sword with the broken sword, by the way, with the band that held it to his hips. He's also laying with his leg on the shield that he held in battle as well. And there we see him from the back at the National Gallery as well. This is a monument to a military victory. We've seen a few Greek monuments to military victories going all the way back to some of our pottery at the very beginning of the Greek period. This particular victory took place in modern-day Turkey, what they called Asia Minor. Alexander the Great had conquered Asia Minor. And in trying to govern this large region to the east, what he ended up doing was leaving military generals in charge of the different regions in Asia Minor. Okay? This was a monument to a military victory by a local leader, Attalus I, in the town of Pergamon, which I've circled on the map there, sort of due south from Istanbul, southwest from Istanbul. Over the marauding hordes that had come down from Europe, the Gauls. Okay. And what's interesting about this monument to a military victory is that it's quite different from the kinds of monuments we've become accustomed to seeing. What do we normally see when we see a monument to a military victory? What are we used to seeing? The victor, right? And usually what? In the act of stomping the crap out of his enemies, right? So, about in Narmstead, right? He's stepping over them, and the enemies are depicted as cowering and afraid, or simply dying, right? Dead, rather than the upright leader. And when they have this image with the epidermis structure, a monument to military victory, they have a focus on the enemy, the defeated enemy. And if I would tell you that it was the enemy, you might think, oh, this is us, because he's dying with some dignity. He's still fighting, he's still fighting. He's still showing us that he's got something left. They're making him into something that's honorable. And another something about earlier time, this shows the enemy as someone who was valiant themselves. I guess what kind of sounds with Mesopotamia as well, right? He's fighting those lions, and he's got like 4 arrows on it, and he still has to go hand to hand and run it through with his sword, you know? If you see the strength of the enemy, it makes the victory that much more valuable. What's the point of using a bazooka against a squirrel? You know? You've got boxing matches, right? There's no match matches, there's no boxing matches, there's no point, otherwise, right? But I was a teenager, and my sister asked me to arm wrestle, and I said, really, what's the point? If I lose, and if I lose, then I lose that, you know? It's going to start doing my ego. You need to have a violent order, to have the victory be that much more memorable, that much more honorable. And that's what we're seeing happen here with this monument to the enemy that Hellenistic defeated in Turkey. So, great to get when they did, we talked about this online, when the Greeks defeated the Persians, they ended up showing up the defeat not as a killing basically of enemy, but as a mythological thing, where the forces of good eventually will conquer the forces of evil. So the rapid from the ground will eventually defeat this race of half-human centaurs. When you touch this and support and use them, but that just adds to the drama. And here we have this very different social story. This is another monument to the same victory. A massive temple that was erected a generation later by Attalus I's son. And again, it was following his death to honor his father as his father's great military victory. And in this case, the work of art turns back to mythology as an allegory for the victory. And at the pergamon altar of Zeus, we see Athena here, the face is broken off, leading the gods into a battle against the giants, a race of giants, who are seen as not as good as this is. They're not so well vessel, that's the type of vessel. And we notice the scale differences. The gods, in fact, are flattering these giants to show us this victory. And they're fighting on behalf of the Athenians and the Greeks. And this becomes a metaphor then for Attalus' victory over the gods and erected a generation after his death. Now it's a Berlin, they were created to fight in the 19th century, took out a good big practice then. And then my first one, they came around the back of the building. And what the museum in Berlin has done is to put them on the sidewalk so you can see them. You have to walk up and down the stairs and out the building to here, right? And that means the streets, next streets on the surface, the structures on the back, those are up there. A single tree is about 400 feet long, which is absolutely massive to the half modules of that size. This principle of the picture is well known. Enhances the sense of drama. You'll notice how kids there have deeply cut their out, and how in one of the pictures, again, the pictures also use a sense of purpose. Here the figure is cut off by the frame on the right, as it stands beyond it. So it gives it a cinematic close-up. And subject is understand this, that grounding is this when you're closer to the action. Think about medicine and all kind of things. You get a really tight shot of the two faces. And that makes the really part of the action. Okay? So a distance shot is kind of aspects of the distance from the shooter. Yeah, focus are trying to really emphasize that that drama of the battle. Exactly. Congress? Yeah, it would be multiple people working under a single director. And all of these things, even at the functional army, that's part of the screenplay. Yeah, way too much for one person. And so they had a team of sculptors working out of the same quarry that they got the stone to the building from. And there would be people who were specialists at certain things. So there's a good chance that the person who's carving these is not the same person who's carving the columns and whatnot, right? But there would have been a team under direction. So, and the point of the director is to make it consistent in style across the entire thing. Yeah, it's impossible. Some people would try Michelangelo, maybe will try, but who never can do it then either. So there's an attempt to make it consistent across all of them, but certainly a whole team working. So Athena here is battling against a series of giants, and you can see that it's brought down low, so instead of up on top, which is where Greek sculpture usually appears, it's brought down low because then this sense of drama becomes that much more strong. And in fact, it's so strong that it's almost like when you're up and down the stairs here, it's like they're spilling out into your space. The stairs that you walk on, right? You can see that the figures themselves also come right out onto the stairs, leaning their knees and their arms down, so that it's almost like a 3D movie, right? Where it's coming out into your space. And that again enhances that sense of engagement between you and the subject matter that you're looking at. That it really is here. And it becomes harder to ignore. I always say that, people sit in the front of the building and say, I'm right here and I look right at you, And what if I gave you the entire lecture for you? Right? Giving you the entire, so close that you can't even see the entire figure, right? And that makes it so that it's very difficult to look away. Very difficult to not pay really close attention to it, right? So there's this cropping that we have that has that effect of heightening the drama. Notice how the hair is swirling away from the figure, that even though the face has worn away, you can see that it's incredibly expressive. And again, this is all a hallmark of Hellenistic art, is this expressiveness. It continues to the bodies. The bodies are also incredibly expressive, twisting and turning in space in a way that was foreign to earlier classical art. This is all about heightening the drama, heightening the sensuality of the figures. And you'll notice that the deeply carved hair and the facial expression that we can see here is noses badly worn, but we have that same look of pathos, that quiet dignity, that suffering that's shown through the face, that is, again, a hallmark of Hellenistic art. So our last Hellenistic sculpture also shows us a strong element of pathos. It's the scene of Laocoon, which is from the Laocoon group by 3 sculptors. This is another Greek original, and it has a really interesting story in that it was buried in the outskirts of Rome and was dug up in Michelangelo's time, around 1600. Actually, 1506, I think it was. And Michelangelo was on hand when they pulled it out of the ground. He was actually watching them excavate it at the time. And some people suggest that he changed his digital style based on this work after having seen it. Notice again the heightened sense of drama, the sense of struggle, and that dignified struggle that's highlighted in the 3 faces here. If you look at Laocoon's face and compare it to either of the struggling giants here, you can see it's an incredibly similar facial expression. sort of shorthand for paper that we see on the figure. Does everyone know the story of Rockwell? Do you know who he wrote? Yeah?
Sometimes they come to know somebody about
Something. Yes, right, Poseidon. So the serpents in the sea stop him from warning somebody about something. What, do you know somebody in the something? Maybe else add to that? Invasion. Okay, Greek history. What's the most famous invasion? Dinner, right? Sure, exactly. He was a priest in the Jewish church. And when the Greeks showed up with the treasure house, he said, hey, beware strangers going good. Right? This is just not right. Why would they be giving us a big wooden house? Don't take the gift. And Poseidon, who wants to do the wind, right? So the serpents from the sea of king. Shut him up. Right? So that the strangers will accept the horse, the strangers jump out of light, and destroy the horse. Right? So here we see the moment when the enemy of Greece, while dying valiantly, right? Because in fact he's right, isn't he? And not only him, but his two sons being killed alongside him. Notice how deeply carved the hair is. How that flow of light and dark that you get across his features with his wrinkles in his face and the swirls of hair adds to the sort of dramatic punch. The strong contrast of light and dark really add to drama, usually when we see it. His sons are also struggling. This kid's had it, right? I mean, there's not much more he can do. That massive snake is wrapped all around him. It makes you want to sort of move around it. And this is a man when they had a stance, so I couldn't walk around the back. I thought I wanted to, you know? And by the way, I used to think he was as big as this room, but he's not like that. He's much smaller than I thought he was. Because he looks so big, you know? That massive, wrenching body of his twists and turns. The two sons give us elements of the story. One of the weapons is probably very nearly dead. The one on the right looks like he might still have a chance. You know, he's usually pulling it out of his leg, but it's still wrapped around his arm. I love the head of that serpent that's biting Laocoon on his hip. He's actually getting eaten as we watch it. So this is really, I think, in many ways, as Hellenistic gets. It's got a certain sensuality. It moves in space. It's a frozen moment, caught in the act of doing something in particular. It invites you to look at it from different points of view so that you see more of the figure than just the frontal view. These are all hallmarks of Hellenistic art that continues from shortly after the classical period all the way till you see this is our first work AD, right? Our first work after Christ, the first century AD. Yeah, Whitney. No, this is a marble original. Probably about multiple blocks put together to make it up. So good at that. Fusing blocks together with dowel systems. And that's all the slides I've got. That's one review. Yeah, I guess that's where again we were tempted to keep walking around it. And we're done about 10 minutes early because that's I don't think I'm going to get that far even. There will be a few more things to make up for those 2 weeks that we had off in the winter. And I'll be getting a review sheet for you for everybody. The test is in 2 weeks, so? Is it 2 weeks? 3 weeks? It's not a week, it's 2 weeks. I looked it up, right? So I'll be showing you a review sheet in plenty of time, and it will be roughly the same size as the ones you've had in the past. The one we've had in the past. November 9th, that's 2 weeks from today, right? Okay, so I'm going to say that by the end of the week. Good.